In 371 before Christ, the most feared army in history was annihilated by a secret weapon they couldn't comprehend. It wasn't a new sword or a stronger shield, it was love. This is the story of how that single emotion broke an empire of super soldiers who had never known defeat. For 100 years, they were a force of nature, a society meticulously engineered for a single brutal purpose: war. Their reputation was a weapon in itself, forged in the fires of a system so harsh it bordered on the inhuman. This system was the agoge. From the tender age of 7, a Spartan boy was ripped from his family and plunged into a life of state-sponsored suffering. He was taught to be a ghost, moving silently through the barracks, and to be a wolf, stealing his food to survive, knowing that if he was caught, the punishment was not for the theft, but for the failure of being discovered. He was given one thin cloak for both the freezing winters and scorching summers. Forced to sleep on a bed of reeds, he cut himself. He was fed black broth, a vile concoction of blood, salt, and vinegar, just enough to keep him alive, but not enough to quell the constant, gnawing hunger. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, he would endure ritual floggings, a contest of endurance where boys would sometimes be whipped to death, their silence in the face of agony a mark of ultimate honor. This was the crucible that burned away every trace of the individual. Compassion, fear, and personal love were not just weaknesses, they were treason against the state. What emerged from this furnace was less a man and more a living weapon, a cog in the most terrifying military machine the world had ever known. A machine that was now marching to crush one final city. But they were oblivious to the fact that their greatest strength was about to become their fatal weakness. In the year 371 before Christ, this force was on the march. Sparta was the undisputed master of Greece. After their grinding victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, they had imposed their will across the Hellenic world, installing oligarchies loyal to them and crushing dissent with an iron fist. But this terrifying machine of war had one fatal flaw, an oversight born from their own inhumanity. They had no answer for an army built on the one thing they had tried to destroy: human connection. That defiance came from Thebes. A few years prior, in a daring midnight raid, Theban rebels, led by a charismatic firebrand named Pelopidas, had liberated their citadel from a Spartan garrison. For Sparta, this was an unforgivable affront that had to be answered in blood. Leading the punitive expedition was the Spartan king himself, Cleombrotus II. He was the embodiment of Spartan confidence, a man who had never known defeat. From his perspective, this was not a war. It was pest control. His mission was to march into Boeotia, disperse the Theban rabble, and either install a new puppet government or simply raze the city to the ground. He rode at the head of an army 11,000 strong, a coalition of Spartan might and their reluctant Peloponnesian allies. At its heart were the 700 Spartiates, the full-blooded warriors at the apex of their society, each one a master of combat. The sun glinted off a forest of bronze spear points. The rhythmic tramp of thousands of sandals on the dusty road was a drumbeat of doom. Their crimson cloaks flowed behind them like a river of blood. As this inexorable force crossed into Theban territory, a palpable sense of dread settled over the land. All of Greece held its breath, waiting for the inevitable execution. While Sparta had perfected the art of breaking men, Thebes had been perfecting a different kind of army. It was a city of vibrant, chaotic life, a hub of commerce and art, and its fate now rested on the shoulders of two extraordinary men. There was the city's hero, the warrior Pelopidas, a man of action and immense personal courage. And then there was his friend, the city's mind, a quiet, almost ascetic man named Epaminondas. He was a philosopher general, a student of Pythagorean harmony, who saw the battlefield not as a place for brute force, but as a complex equation of geometry and psychology, a dissonant chord waiting to be resolved. He believed a soldier fought most fiercely not when his spirit was crushed, but when it was inspired. And he was about to build an army on an idea so radical it was considered by many to be insane. This philosophy was the bedrock for the Theban army's elite corps, the Sacred Band of Thebes. It was an institution without parallel, comprised of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 of the finest soldiers in the city, with the hero Pelopidas himself as their commander. The logic behind its creation was as simple as it was profound. The philosopher Plato would later write that an army of lovers would be invincible, for a man would rather die 1,000 times than be shamed in the eyes of his beloved. He would never drop his shield, never abandon his post, never flee. He would stand and fight with the ferocity of a lion to protect the person who stood beside him in the shield wall. This deep, personal love, the very emotion the agoge was designed to eradicate, was the Thebans' secret weapon, an armor of the soul, a force multiplier that could not be quantified by military bean counters. As the Spartan king and his massive army drew near, a political storm erupted within Thebes. The assembly was a cauldron of fear and recrimination. Factions loyal to Sparta argued that resistance was madness, a collective act of suicide. They pointed to the numbers: 7,000 Thebans and their allies against 11,000 of the most feared soldiers in the world. But more than the numbers, they pointed to history, to a century of unbroken Spartan victories. To face them on the open field was to choose annihilation. Surrender, they argued, was the only logical path. It was the philosopher general who rose to speak. In a calm, steady voice that cut through the panic, he laid out the stark choice before them. They could submit, hand over their leaders for execution, and live as Spartan subjects, their democracy a forgotten dream. Or they could march out to meet them, to fight for that freedom on their own terms, as free men. Even if defeat is our fate, he argued, it is a far greater glory to die defending our home than to live in chains, having surrendered it without a struggle. His words, resonating with a philosopher's logic and a patriot's fire, silenced the opposition. The decision was made. Thebes would fight. But fighting was the easy part. Survival depended on a plan that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. On the plains of Leuctra, two armies camped under the same summer sky. One slept with the easy confidence of a predator that has never known a true challenger. The other stared into the darkness, knowing that the morning sun would bring either the greatest victory in Greek history or their complete and total annihilation. The night before the battle was an agony of suspense. In the Theban camp, the air was thick with the smell of nervous sweat and sacrificial fires. Soldiers sharpened their spear points, checked the straps on their shields, and wrote final letters home. They could hear the sounds from the Spartan camp across the plain, not of fear, but of eerie, disciplined calm. Ominous portents were reported to the Theban commanders. Sacred temple snakes had disappeared, and a prophecy was recalled of a Spartan defeat at a place associated with virgins, a description that fit the plain of Leuctra, where the tombs of two mythical maidens lay. The philosopher general seized on these omens, using them to weave a narrative of divine favor for his nervous troops. In his command tent, he gathered his fellow commanders to finalize his strategy. What he described to them was not just unconventional, it was a flagrant violation of every military doctrine they had ever known. Greek warfare for centuries had been a ritualized slaughter. Two armies would form up in long rectangular phalanxes, 8 to 12 ranks deep, and crash into each other head-on in a horrific, grinding contest of shoving and stabbing. Victory usually went to the army with more discipline or more men. The Theban strategist told his stunned commanders they would do none of this. He explained that to fight Sparta on their terms was to lose before the first man died. Their only hope was to refuse the ritual, to change the geometry of the battlefield. Here was his breathtaking gamble. He would mass their superior cavalry to attack first, creating a screen of chaos. Then, the infantry. He ordered his center and his right flank to be intentionally thinned out and to advance at an angle, holding back from the main fight. Their job was not to win, but to delay and survive. One of the generals protested, arguing this would expose their entire army to being flanked and destroyed. The strategist calmly explained that the rest of the army was the distraction. The real battle, he insisted, would be over in minutes, decided by what he planned to do on his left flank. There, he would concentrate his absolute best troops, the hero Pelopidas and the sacred band, at the very tip of the spear, into a formation of unprecedented depth. Not 12 ranks, not 20, but 50. It was not a line, it was a column, a human battering ram 50 men thick and nearly 100 men wide. This hammer, he concluded, would not be aimed at the Spartan army. It was to be aimed with surgical precision at the Spartan right wing, at the exact position of the Spartan king himself. The plan was not to win the push, it was to obliterate the Spartan command structure in one single, overwhelming blow. The Spartan line began its advance, a slow, terrifying rhythm of marching feet and chanting paeans, the sound that had broken the will of armies for a century. But this time, something was wrong. The Theban line opposite them wasn't a line at all. It was a lopsided, malformed thing. It was a spearhead, aimed not at their army, but directly at their king. As the two armies closed the distance, the first clash was in the air. A storm of dust kicked up by thousands of hooves. The Theban cavalry, better trained and more numerous, surged forward with a thunderous roar. They smashed into the Spartan cavalry, a force composed mostly of non-citizens and considered secondary to the infantry. The contest was short and brutal. The Spartan horsemen were scattered and driven from the field, but the Theban cavalry did not stop. They wheeled around the flank of the advancing Spartan phalanx, a menacing cloud of disruption that prevented the Spartans' allied skirmishers from supporting their main line and created the first seed of confusion in their ordered ranks. Then came the infantry. The Spartan king, standing among his royal guard on the right, watched the Theban formation advance and was puzzled. The enemy's right flank seemed to be lagging, almost retreating, in a display of what he took for cowardice. He ordered his own line to press forward and to the right, intending to overlap and envelop this hesitant wing. He had no idea he was being baited, his own line becoming stretched and disordered as he lunged for the trap. He didn't see the true danger until it was too late. On his direct front, the Theban left was coming on not as a line, but as a monstrous column, a solid mass of muscle and bronze, moving with terrifying speed and purpose. The impact was a cataclysm. The sound was not the usual scraping and crashing of a phalanx engagement. It was the sound of a landslide, of a building collapsing. The sheer kinetic energy of the 50-deep Theban formation was a force of physics the 12-deep Spartan line could not possibly withstand. The front ranks of the Spartan phalanx were not pushed back. They were obliterated, crushed into the men behind them, their shields splintering, their spears snapping, their bones breaking under the immense, irresistible pressure. From the perspective of a Spartan hoplite in the third rank, one moment he was advancing with the confidence of a god of war. The next, the man in front of him simply vanished, and a wall of Theban shields and spear points materialized in his place. The Spartans were the finest individual warriors in Greece, but they were being crushed by an idea. Their phalanx, designed for a two-dimensional fight, was being torn apart by a three-dimensional concept. It bent, it buckled, and for the first time in memory, it began to break. The fighting around the Spartan king was a vortex of savage, desperate combat. He and his 300 hippies, his royal bodyguard, fought with the suicidal bravery expected of them, creating a small pocket of resistance. But they were overwhelmed. The hero Pelopidas and the sacred band, fighting with the sublime fury of men, protecting all they held dear, carved their way relentlessly into the Spartan command. A Theban spear found a gap in the king's armor. He fell, mortally wounded. A brutal, swirling melee erupted over his body as his guards desperately tried to drag him back, while the Thebans pressed forward to claim the ultimate prize. In that bloody struggle, the Spartan will to fight died with their king. Seeing their leader fall and their flank collapsing into a chaotic rout, a feeling no Spartan soldier had ever known on a battlefield began to spread through the ranks. Panic. The unbreakable spear, the myth that had held Greece in its thrall for a century, shattered in a single, cataclysmic moment. The dust settled on the plain of Leuctra, revealing a sight no living Greek had ever seen. A Spartan army, broken and defeated, sending a herald to ask for a truce to collect their dead. In that moment, an entire world of fear and certainty died, and a new one was born in its place. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the noise. The surviving Spartans, having finally recovered the body of their king after a heroic and costly effort, retreated to their camp. They were a study in shock, their stoic facades shattered, replaced by a grim, hollow disbelief. The Thebans, exhausted and bloodied, stood victorious on the field, leaning on their spears and gazing at the carnage, scarcely able to comprehend what they had just accomplished. The formal request for a truce was the ultimate admission of defeat, a humiliation Sparta had never before suffered, and an undeniable signal to the rest of Greece that the impossible had happened. The casualty numbers told the story with brutal clarity. The Thebans and their allies had lost fewer than 300 men. The Spartans and their Peloponnesian allies lost nearly 2,000. But the most devastating number, the one that would echo through the halls of Sparta like a death knell, was this. Of the 700 elite Spartiates who had marched onto the field that morning, 400 lay dead. It was a catastrophic, demographically crippling loss, a blow from which their society, with its dwindling number of pure-blooded citizens, would never recover. The news of the defeat at Leuctra sent a political earthquake rumbling through Greece. The myth of Spartan invincibility was not just cracked, it was vaporized. For decades, Sparta's power had rested as much on the idea of their supremacy as on their actual army. Now, that idea is dead. The fear was gone. Subject states that had long chafed under Spartan rule, like Arcadia and Elis, rose up in open rebellion, forming their own leagues and alliances. Most critically, the Helots of Messenia, the vast slave population upon whom the entire Spartan way of life depended, saw their chance. With Theban aid led by the philosopher general himself, they revolted and founded the new fortified city of Messene on the slopes of Mount Ithome, a permanent, independent fortress, a dagger pointed at Sparta's heart. Sparta's empire didn't decline, it collapsed, almost overnight. They were forced to retreat into their own lands, their power broken forever, their entire society thrown into a crisis from which it would never fully emerge. But the shockwave of Leuctra didn't end with the fall of Sparta. Its true legacy, the final mind-blowing ripple effect of that day, would only be revealed years later. A young Macedonian prince was sent to Thebes as a political hostage. For 3 years, he lived in the house of a Theban general, where he became a student of the city's culture and, most importantly, its military philosophy. There, he watched, and he learned the secrets of the philosopher general's new way of war. He would take that knowledge home, reform his own army, using those very principles, and perfect them. He would then pass this military knowledge on to his son, a son who would be known to the world as Alexander the Great. The impossible plan that saved a single city from annihilation would become the blueprint used to conquer the known world, proving that history is not always made by the largest army, but sometimes by the most brilliant idea.